My mother picked my sister as her favorite child, and when they needed help, I told her to go ask the daughter she chose. Have you ever felt like you were living in a different reality than your own family? Like you were a backup dancer in a story where someone else was always the star? Because I spent decades in that role until one night I just snapped. And what happened after that changed everything. The night I finally admitted to myself that my family had officially picked their favorite child, I was standing in my tiny kitchen. I was trying not to cry into a bowl of cold macaroni that my son had already refused to eat. The baby monitor hummed next to my elbow. My back ached from another long day at the clinic, and my phone was face down. I was sick of watching my own mother ignore every picture I posted of my growing belly, while she commented hearts under every single thing my sister shared. I know that sounds dramatic, but trust me, this didn't start with pregnancy posts. That was just the moment everything clicked into focus in a way I couldn't unsee anymore. I'm Tessa, by the way. It's a name nobody ever remembers unless they want something from me. I was always the one who tried to be reasonable, accommodating, the one who smoothed things over, the oldest daughter, the rule follower, got the steady job, married the safe guy, tried to do everything the right way. My sister? She was always the baby, the fragile one, the poor thing who needed extra understanding. If you grew up with a golden child, you already know where this is going. It's like you're both in the same story, but the subtitles under your face are completely different. When I married my ex, I genuinely thought I was stepping into the stable life my parents always said they wanted for us. Small wedding, plastic tablecloths, a very sweaty uncle on the microphone. My mother cried. My father gave a toast. My sister tried on my veil, and everyone laughed like it was the cutest thing. I remember thinking, if I just keep doing what I'm supposed to do, the rest will fall into place. That's the kind of optimism I almost miss, even if it was painfully naive. A little over 2 years later, I got pregnant with my son. I work as a medical assistant, so I've seen every kind of pregnancy scare. But when it was my test turning positive in my tiny bathroom, I just sat on the edge of the tub and shook. Excited, terrified, proud. My ex hugged me, spun me around, talked about Little League. And for a while I really believed he was as all in as he sounded. My mother called every day, asking about every cramp and craving, telling everyone she knew she was going to be a grandmother. My sister smiled in pictures, said she was happy for me. If there was a flicker of something else in her eyes when she looked at my bump, I ignored it. I wanted to believe we were all on the same team. The first crack showed up after our son was born. If you've ever had a newborn, you know sleep becomes this weird rumor you hear about but never experience. I was up at all hours, nursing, rocking, texting other exhausted moms in the dark, trying not to resent the man snoring in the bedroom while I paced with a crying baby. At first, I told myself he was just tired, that we'd find a rhythm. Then the late nights started. He'd come home later and later, smelling like bars he swore he didn't have time to stop at. New friends I'd never heard of. Vague work obligations that always involved him showering and putting on cologne after I'd already changed into pajamas. When I asked questions, he accused me of being controlling, of not understanding his pressure. I still remember the night it blew up. I was standing at the crib, bouncing our son, my shoulders screaming, when his phone wouldn't stop buzzing on the dresser. I tried to ignore it, but it just kept lighting up, vibrating against the wood. I finally walked over, mostly to put on silent, and I saw my sister's name. Not just once, over and over. Stacked notifications from a message thread I'd never noticed. I told myself I'd just put on silent. I wasn't going to snoop. I trusted him. Then a preview popped up. My stomach dropped so fast, I almost sat on the floor. She had written something like, "So, when are you finally going to tell her about us? I'm tired of hiding." There were hearts, inside jokes, references to things that had happened in my parents' backyard on days I remembered looking for my husband because he'd disappeared during family barbecues. I felt the baby's weight in my arms, heavy and warm and completely innocent. My whole world tilted sideways. I opened the thread. I read enough to understand this wasn't some emotional overreaction, not a misunderstanding. This was a full-on affair, happening right under my nose, in my parents' house, with the woman who used to steal my clothes and then cry until my mother told me to apologize for overreacting. When he walked in that night, a little flushed, smelling like cheap beer and a perfume I didn't recognize, I was standing in the living room with his phone in my hand and our son in the baby swing. I didn't scream. I just held up the screen and asked very quietly, "How long?" There was this moment where he clearly thought about lying, about some ridiculous story of miscommunication. Then his shoulders dropped. He admitted it, like he was telling me he forgot to pick up milk. He said it had been going on since I was pregnant. He said they'd always had a connection. He said he didn't mean to hurt me, the classic line people use when they absolutely knew they were going to hurt you and did it anyway. I told him to get out. No dramatic pause. No long monologue. No negotiation. I told him very calmly, considering how much my hands were shaking, that he could pack a bag and go stay with whoever was worth blowing up a marriage and a newborn for. He had the nerve to tell me I was being hysterical. I laughed in his face and pointed at the door until he finally grabbed some clothes and left. After he was gone, I called my mother. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. I needed her to say what he and my sister had done was unforgivable. I needed her to be on my side for once. She listened. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Well, you have to understand. Your sister has always struggled with feeling second best." I just sat there, the phone pressed to my ear, staring at the stain on the carpet from when my son's bottle had leaked. Second best to who exactly? Because it had never been me. I was always the one who had to suck it up, to compromise, to apologize first. My mother told me we needed to be careful about how we handled this, so people wouldn't think badly of the family. She actually suggested that maybe I had been distant in my marriage, and that could have pushed him away. She said my sister was very fragile, and we all needed to be gentle. If you've never felt your heart harden in real time, let me tell you it's a very specific sensation. I hung up that night knowing my mother wasn't going to save me from this, that if I wanted out, I'd have to drag myself out, and drag my baby with me. I found a lawyer. I filed for divorce. I worked at the clinic all day, fed a baby all night, and filled out paperwork at the kitchen table, while my ex sent me long messages about how cold and unforgiving I was being. My sister didn't reach out once. Instead, 2 months after the divorce was official, she and my ex announced their engagement. Like this was some quirky little love story the universe had written for them. My mother didn't just accept it. She threw herself into that wedding like it was a royal event. Dress shopping, cake tastings. She called me to tell me how sad it would look if I didn't attend. She used the word optics. She said we couldn't give people the impression that our family was broken, as if my sister sleeping with my husband while I was still bleeding from childbirth hadn't already done that. When I told her there was no world in which I would dress up, put on lipstick, hire a babysitter, and watch those two exchange vows, she gasped, like I had suggested tripping my sister down the aisle. She said, "You are a mother now. Think about the example you are setting." That was the moment something in me permanently flipped. I told her the example I was setting was that you are allowed to walk away from people who treat you like you are disposable. I told her she could go to that wedding, smile in the pictures, and tell whatever story she wanted, but I wouldn't be there making it look normal. She cried. She told me I was tearing the family apart. I reminded her who had started ripping at the seams. The drama didn't stay inside our little circle. My ex's family started whispering that my baby might not even be his. Honestly, that was kind of impressive, considering I was the one who had been home changing diapers while he was sneaking around. He filed something in court about questioning paternity, because apparently paying child support for the child you already agreed to raise is optional if your pride is hurt enough. I had to go in for a test. All swabs and paperwork, and a bored technician who had seen this exact circus 1,000 times. The results came back, obviously confirming what we already knew. He was the father. He was also a coward. Those two things can coexist. The only good thing that came out of that mess was that once the DNA test shut everyone up, the court locked in child support. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to keep the lights on when I was juggling formula and rent and gas. I picked up extra shifts at the clinic. I learned to budget down to the last dollar. I became the kind of tired that settles into your bones and makes you forget what it feels like to be carefree. But I also slowly built something like a life. I had my son. I had coworkers who would slip me leftover snacks. I had a tiny apartment with peeling cabinets and a leaky faucet that was all mine. About a year after the divorce, one of my friends from the clinic dragged me to a birthday party. I almost didn't go because the idea of putting on real pants and smiling at strangers sounded like punishment, but she insisted. That's where I met the man who would eventually become my husband. I'm not going to get into every detail because this isn't a romance movie, but what I will say is that he showed up consistently. He asked about my son first. He showed up with takeout and sat on the floor helping build block towers. He listened when I told him the bare-bones version of my history and didn't flinch or make jokes about drama. We dated for about a year and a half before we moved in, partly because I was cautious and partly because I needed to see that he could handle the reality of my life, not just the cute parts. When he proposed, it was in our living room after my son had finally gone to sleep, with a ring he clearly could barely afford and hands shaking so much he almost dropped it. I said yes, obviously, because by then he felt less like a new chapter and more like the safe place I'd been looking for, without having the words for it. We had a small ceremony at a local community center. My parents were invited. My mother came. My father hovered in the back, like he was afraid to commit to being there. My sister didn't show, which was fine by me. There were no dramatic speeches, just a lot of relief and a weird kind of quiet joy that I didn't trust yet, but wanted to. A few months after the wedding, I found out I was pregnant again. This time it felt different. I was still scared, obviously. Babies don't come with pause buttons. But I wasn't alone in that fear. My husband went with me to every appointment, held my hand during blood draws, rubbed my back when I was hunched over the toilet. My son was old enough to be excited in his own confused way. He'd pat my stomach and ask if the baby could hear him when he told her about his favorite toys. It felt like this fragile little bubble of happiness that I was desperate to protect. I started posting small things about the pregnancy on a social media app. Nothing wild, just pictures of my growing bump, the blurry ultrasound, a picture of my son holding a tiny onesie. My circle online was pretty small, mostly coworkers, a few school moms, some friends from way back who hadn't picked sides in the divorce. People left sweet comments. They sent heart emojis. They asked how I was feeling. It was the kind of normal, basic joy that most people take for granted. Then my mother called. I remember looking at her name on my screen and feeling that familiar heaviness in my chest. We'd been in this weird half-contact for a while, talking mostly about weather and my job, carefully avoiding the huge, screaming mess in the middle of our relationship. I answered anyway, because part of me still wanted a mother. She didn't even bother with small talk. She went straight in. She said, "You need to stop posting about this pregnancy." At first, I thought I'd misheard her. I asked her what she meant. She sighed. The dramatic kind of sigh she saves for when she thinks she's about to say something very wise. She said, "Your sister is trying to have a baby, and it's not working. Every time you post another picture, it's like you're rubbing it in her face. People are talking. They say you're cruel. You should be more considerate." I stood there in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd cried over the affair, with my free hand on my stomach, feeling little flutters and wondering how we got here. I told her I was just sharing normal stuff, the same way other people did. I wasn't tagging my sister. I wasn't writing long captions about karma. I was just excited. My mother didn't care. She said, "You know, she has always struggled. You have what she wants. The least you can do is be discreet. Maybe don't post anything. Maybe keep this for yourself so you don't humiliate her like this." That word, humiliate, hit me like a slap. I asked her how exactly I was humiliating my sister by being pregnant with my husband's baby. She started talking about how people compare, how they whisper, how they look at my sister with pity. She actually said they say she's defective, like she was just quoting the weather report. I felt this mix of anger and disbelief, and this old, familiar shame that didn't even belong to me. I told her very clearly that I was not going to hide my pregnancy like it was something shameful. I told her I understood that my sister was hurting, but that didn't mean I had to erase my own life. I said something like, if she cannot look at a bump without spiraling, maybe she should talk to someone who gets paid to listen. My mother gasped like I had suggested kicking a puppy. She tried to guilt me into backing down. She said things like, "I thought I raised you to be kind, and she would do this for you," which was laughable, considering the history. When she realized I wasn't budging, she got cold. She said, "Fine, just remember who has always been there for you when you needed help," which was hilarious because the answer to that had never been her. We hung up and I stood there shaking, one hand on the counter, one hand on my stomach, trying to decide if I was overreacting. The thing about growing up in a house where your feelings are constantly minimized is that you start treating your own instincts like they're suspect. Over the next few days, my mother escalated the way only she knows how. She started showing up at my apartment without warning. I'd get home from a long shift and find her sitting on the front steps, arms crossed, face tight, clearly ready for a fight. She'd bang on the door, louder than necessary, calling my name in that tone that makes neighbors peek through blinds. One time, she started in on me right there in the hallway about shoving happiness down people's throats, while my son clung to my leg and the woman from across the hall pretended she was checking her mail. After that, a neighbor pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay. I wanted to sink into the floor. My mother also started calling her relatives and whatever mutual friends she could reach, telling her version of the story. In her version, I was flaunting my pregnancy online to torture my poor, barren sister. She left out the part about betraying your sibling with her husband. It's funny how details like that slip her mind. At a certain point, I realized that if I didn't set a hard line, she was going to keep pushing until she crashed right through my front door. I sat down one evening after my son was asleep and typed out a message to her that I must have rewritten at least 10 times. In the end, it was simple. I told her that any further attempts to shame me for being pregnant, any comments about my children, any showing up unannounced and causing scenes outside my home would result in me cutting contact completely. I told her I meant it. I hit send, put my phone face down, and stared at the ceiling until my eyes hurt. For a while, things were weirdly quiet. She stopped dropping by. She stopped calling. I kept posting little bits about the pregnancy. Nothing wild, just enough to feel like I wasn't hiding. Then one afternoon, someone I barely knew pulled me aside in the parking lot after work. She's a friend of my sister's, the kind of person who always seems to know every piece of gossip before anyone else. She said, "Look, I know it's not my place, but I feel like you should know something." It turned out that my sister and my ex had never actually gone to a doctor about their so-called fertility problems. They had just assumed the issue was her because he already had a child. She had been swallowing supplements, tracking her temperature, crying on my mother's shoulder about her broken body. All that time, he was walking around with a secret that made my stomach turn. Apparently, a few years into their marriage, he had gone and gotten a vasectomy without telling her. He didn't want more kids. Not with her, not with anyone. He let her blame herself while he carried that little bit of information around like a loaded gun. She only found out because they had some kind of drunken fight where he finally spit it out to hurt her feelings on purpose. I remember standing there in the parking lot, my belly heavy, car keys digging into my palm, feeling this bitter mix of vindication and disgust. I'm not going to pretend I felt sorry for her in that moment, because I didn't. What I felt was confirmation. Confirmation that I hadn't been the crazy one, that this man had always been selfish and cruel in ways other people could finally see now. I also felt this strange, quiet relief that for once my mother's favorite was getting a tiny taste of what it felt like to be on the receiving end of their bad choices. I didn't reach out. I didn't send a message. I went home, made dinner, helped my son with a puzzle, and tried to focus on the little life rolling around under my skin. When it was finally time for my daughter to be born, I went into labor in the classic romantic way, standing in the frozen foods aisle, staring at a bag of peas, feeling a weird pressure, and then a very clear, "Oh, okay, this is happening." My husband rushed me to the hospital. My son went to stay with a neighbor he adored, and I mentally prepared myself to do this whole birth thing again. Before we had even checked in, I had already left instructions with the nurses about visitors. I gave them a list of names of people who were allowed in the room. My mother's name was not on it. Our daughter arrived after hours of contractions and cursing, and a brief moment where I swore I was never doing this again. She was small and perfect and loud, with a tiny, wrinkled face that somehow made every miserable thing I had gone through feel like backstory instead of the whole story. My husband cried harder than the baby. I held her against my chest and felt the weird, overwhelming rush of love and panic and responsibility wash over me all over again. On the second day, while I was still sore and exhausted and trying to figure out breastfeeding round 2, a nurse came in looking uncomfortable. She said there was someone at the front desk insisting on being allowed up to see me and the baby. I didn't even have to ask who. My mother had shown up armed with whatever speech she had been practicing. She was apparently telling the staff that she was the grandmother, that she had rights, that I was being unreasonable. I looked at the nurse and said, "She is not on my approved list. I do not want her in here." The nurse nodded, relieved, and went back out to deal with it. I could hear muffled voices in the hallway, my mother's rising in pitch, demanding to see her grandchild, throwing around phrases like family rights, like that meant something in a hospital that had my signed paperwork on file. Eventually, the noise faded. She left. She didn't leave a note. She didn't send a text saying she was glad we were okay. It was all about the performance. Once we were home and somewhat settled, I posted a picture on the same social media app. It was just my son sitting on the couch, cradling his baby sister like she was made of glass, his face more serious than I had ever seen it. The caption was something simple about the meeting. My settings were locked down tight by then. Only people I actually trusted could see anything I posted. They flooded the picture with comments, little hearts, jokes about him being promoted to Big Brother. For a few days, it almost felt normal. Then, my work email pinged. Not the one connected to the clinic, the one nobody outside of my job was supposed to have. I opened it and saw my mother's name as the sender. She had apparently gone digging through old school records or some shared paperwork to find it, because there is no universe where I would have given it to her on purpose. The subject line was something stupidly dramatic, like "what you have done," which already made me roll my eyes. The email itself was long, pages long. She accused me of weaponizing my children. She accused me of being a bad daughter, a cold person, a selfish woman who would rather parade her joy online than think about her poor, suffering sister. She said disgusting things about my kids, implying they were being raised without proper morals, calling my husband names, questioning my mental stability. It was one of those messes of words that starts as guilt and ends as pure venom. I read it once, feeling my stomach flip, my hands go cold, that familiar old shame trying to creep back up my spine. Then I took a deep breath, made a new folder in my email labeled documentation, dragged it in there, and closed the tab. I didn't respond. I didn't forward it around. I just kept it. I knew in some deep, tired way that if this ever turned into some big he said, she said, I wanted proof of who she really was when nobody else was watching. What I didn't expect was how fast that email would leak into my regular life without me ever sharing it. A few months later, when I was finally somewhat human again instead of a milk machine, I started noticing a shift at my son's school. One of the other moms, a woman who used to invite us over for playdates and complain about homework with me, started acting distant. Another made a comment at pickup about how sad it was when grandparents couldn't see their grandkids because some people hold grudges forever. The way she said it wasn't neutral. It was pointed. Eventually, one of them just asked. She pulled me aside near the playground and said, "So why will you not let your mom see the kids?" In that moment, I realized my mother had not just been screaming into the void. She had gone on a little campaign, calling people, telling them her tragic story about the ungrateful daughter keeping the grandchildren from the loving grandmother. I could almost hear the phrases she had used. Knowing her, I had a choice. I could either shrug and say it was complicated, or I could pull back the curtain just enough to stop people from buying tickets to her victim show, with a few people I actually trusted. I chose the second option. I told them a shorter, gentler version of the truth, that my sister had an affair with my husband, that my mother had chosen sides, that she had sent me an email attacking my children. When one friend looked like she didn't know what to believe, I pulled up the email on my phone and let her read a few lines. Her face changed. Something in her eyes hardened in the direction of my mother. She said, "Okay, that's enough. I get it," and handed my phone back like it was radioactive. I didn't need to circulate it. I just needed a few key people to understand that the situation wasn't some silly grudge. It was self-preservation. The hardest part, honestly, was explaining any of this to my son in a way that didn't dump all the adult poison onto his little shoulders. One afternoon, he came home from school, tossed his backpack on the floor, and asked very quietly, "Why does Grandma hate us?" That question cut deeper than any email ever could. I pulled him onto the couch, took a breath, and told him something true but age-appropriate. I said that sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt other people, and when those people refuse to say sorry or stop the hurt, we have to protect ourselves. I told him it was not his fault, that none of this had anything to do with him being lovable, because he was very lovable. He nodded like he sort of understood and sort of didn't, which is honestly how most adults feel about family drama anyway. Life settled into a new kind of normal after that. There were school routines and baby checkups and late-night feedings and bills, and the occasional pang when I saw other people post pictures with their parents holding their kids. I would be lying if I said I never felt jealous of that easy generational love. But every time I considered reaching out, I thought about that email, about the look on my son's face, about standing in that hospital room while my mother argued with a nurse instead of asking if I was okay. Then, out of nowhere, my sister called. We hadn't spoken since before my daughter was born. Her name popping up on my screen felt like watching a ghost try to FaceTime me. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity and old habits won. I answered. She started talking like no time had passed. Her voice sugary sweet, asking about the kids, asking about my job, acting like she hadn't helped blow my life up in the most personal way possible. I kept my voice pretty flat in those situations because I've learned that any sign of emotion gets used against me. I gave her short answers. Nothing she could twist into something else. After a few minutes of that awkward, fake small talk, she finally got to the point. She told me she was getting divorced from my ex. She was devastated. He had lied to her for years. He had gotten a vasectomy without telling her. He had gaslit her into thinking she was broken, while he had secretly decided her body wasn't going to carry his kids. She cried loud, messy sobs into the phone. She talked about how cheated she felt, how humiliated, how painful it was to realize the person you trusted had used you. I listened for a while because I'm not made of stone, and I know what that feels like. Then she said the wildest thing. She asked me to support her. She actually said, "I really need my sister right now." There was a long, thick silence after that. I could hear her breathing. I could hear my refrigerator humming. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Finally, I said, "You needed a sister when you decided to start seeing my husband behind my back. You needed a sister when you walked down the aisle with him 2 months after our divorce. You did not need me then. So why do you need me now?" She tried to say it was different, that she really loved him, that she didn't fully understand what she had done back then, that she had been young and confused. I reminded her that we were the same age, that she knew exactly what she was doing when she snuck around in her parents' house. When she dressed up in a white dress and smiled for the camera, she got defensive fast. The tears dried up. The insults started. She called me bitter. She said I was jealous because my life hadn't turned out the way I wanted. She said I was poisoning my children against their own family. I listened up until the moment she said something nasty about my daughter, about how kids pick up on their mother's coldness, and then I hung up. No warning, no dramatic goodbye, just click. After that, she tried to contact me through a few fake profiles on social media, leaving vague comments and weird little hints, but I had already locked my accounts down and learned to hit block without hesitating. There's a kind of peace that comes with finally believing people when they show you who they are, even if that belief hurts. The universe, however, has a very dark sense of humor sometimes. One afternoon, I was at a pediatrician's office for my daughter's checkup. The waiting room was the usual chaos of toys, tired parents, and kids licking things they definitely shouldn't be licking. I was bouncing my daughter on my knee when a woman walked in with a little boy around 3, maybe 4, holding her hand. There was something about his face that made my stomach twist. It was familiar in a way I couldn't place right away. She sat down a few chairs away, and we did that mom thing where you smile at each other because your kids are making the same kind of mess. We started talking, just casual stuff about nap schedules and snacks. She mentioned that she was basically doing everything on her own because the boy's father wasn't very involved. I nodded because sadly that wasn't exactly rare. Then she said his name. It was my ex's name. I didn't react right away. I just kept my face neutral and asked very carefully, "Oh, how do you know him?" She said they had dated for a little while, that it hadn't been serious for him, but it had been serious enough for her to end up pregnant. He hadn't denied the child, but he hadn't exactly stepped up either. She rolled her eyes and said something about men who think paying for a few diapers makes them heroes. I did the math in my head. The age of the boy, the timeline of when he and my sister had started trying for a baby, the window when he must have gone for that secret procedure. It hit me that he had given another woman a child and then cut off his own ability to have any more, while my sister was crying in bathroom stalls over negative tests. I wish I could say I felt some kind of triumphant satisfaction, but mostly I just felt tired. Tired for all of us, for every woman in that waiting room who had rearranged her life around a man who treated commitment like a temporary tattoo. I didn't tell her my whole backstory. That would have been too much for a doctor's waiting room. I just listened. And when she apologized for oversharing, I told her she didn't need to be sorry. I left that appointment feeling weirdly lighter, like the last little piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. He was exactly who I thought he was. Not just to me, not just to my sister, to everyone. I never told my sister about that little boy in the waiting room. Let her keep believing she was the only one he ever lied to. Some truths are more useful when you keep them to yourself. After a while, the gossip about my mother started catching up with her. People she had called to complain about me started seeing a bigger picture. Some of them backed away. She ended up more isolated than she had ever been. Meanwhile, my sister's divorce was finalized. She moved back in with my mother for a bit, then took a job in another city because she needed a fresh start, which is what people say when they are running from the consequences of their own choices. I heard through the same grapevine my mother used to weaponize that my sister left pretty abruptly, packed her stuff, hugged my mother at the door, and drove off without much looking back. My mother, who had spent years bending herself into a pretzel to protect her, was suddenly alone in that house. No favorite child to orbit. No grand narrative to sell people about all the sacrifices she had made for her fragile baby. Just silence and the occasional relative who still picked up the phone. In my house, things were not perfect, but they were stable in a way that felt almost luxurious. My husband went to work and came home. He helped with homework. He changed diapers without acting like he deserved a medal. My son started calling him Dad on his own one day, casually while they were building a pillow fort. We didn't correct him. My ex's court-ordered visits became more and more inconsistent. He would cancel at the last minute, reschedule, forget. My son stopped asking about him as much. When he did come, it was awkward and shallow, like he was visiting a friend's kid instead of his own. At one point, my son looked at me before a scheduled visit and said, "Do I have to go if I don't want to?" That question sat heavy on my chest. I talked to my husband about it. We made an appointment with a lawyer. Not because we wanted to erase his father, but because we wanted the legal structure to reflect reality instead of some fantasy of involvement that didn't exist. The lawyer explained that it would take time, that judges like stability on paper even when real life looks different, but that we had a case given the missed visits and my son's own wishes as he got older. It was the first time I walked out of a legal office feeling like the system might actually be leaning a little bit in my direction instead of just at me. It still took months of paperwork and waiting, but eventually the visits shifted to being on my son's terms instead of a schedule that only looked good on paper. By the time he was old enough to really decide, he simply stopped going. One year, a holiday card showed up from his father, and my son handed it to me and said I could throw it away if I wanted. I didn't. I just put it in a drawer and never opened it. That felt like enough. 2 years or so after the worst of everything, when my daughter was toddling around and my son was correcting adults about the proper way to build a fort, my mother called again. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. She had changed phones, which honestly felt on brand. She had apparently gotten my new contact information from a distant cousin who still spoke to her out of habit more than anything. Her voice sounded different, smaller somehow, but still with that old edge of drama. She told me she had been having health problems, that money was tight, that the house needed repairs she couldn't afford. She mentioned a fall she had taken in the kitchen, how she had lain there for a while before managing to get up. She painted a picture of this fragile, lonely woman in a creaky house. And I'm not going to lie, it did something to me. It's hard to turn off the part of you that was trained from birth to take care of everyone else's feelings. Then she got to the point. She wanted help, money, rides to appointments. Maybe we could talk about the kids visiting on weekends. She said she missed them. She said she had made mistakes, but that family was family. She reminded me of all the times she had been there for me, which mostly meant she had told me to lower my expectations, so I wouldn't be disappointed when people hurt me. I listened. I let her talk herself in circles, listing every ache and pain, every unpaid bill. I thought about my son asking why she hated us. I thought about her banging on my apartment door, about that email sitting in a folder in my inbox, about her standing in a hospital hallway arguing about her rights instead of asking how my labor had gone. I thought about my sister driving away, leaving her with the mess she had helped create. When she finally ran out of words and waited for my answer, I took a deep breath and said very calmly, "You should ask the daughter you chose." There was a beat of silence on the line. Then she started to say my name in that scolding voice, but I was done. I said, "I hope you get the help you need. It just is not going to be for me." And I hung up. No yelling, no tears, no shaking hands. I set the phone down on the kitchen table, turned back to the stove, and stirred the pot of pasta for my kids' dinner. My husband walked in a few minutes later, kissed my cheek, and asked who had called. I told him in a few sentences what had happened. He nodded, wrapped his arms around me from behind, and said, "I'm proud of you," into my hair. The baby monitor hummed on the counter. My son yelled from the living room that the fort was collapsing. The sauce started to bubble. I stood there for a second, wooden spoon in my hand, feeling the weight of all those years pressing down, and then lifting just enough to let me breathe. My family likes to tell themselves that I'm the one who ruined everything, that I'm the one who walked away, that I'm the one holding grudges. Maybe in their story that's true. In mine, I finally stepped out of a role I never agreed to in the first place. I stopped being the backup character in the saga of my sister's feelings and became the main person in my own life. If that makes me the villain at their dinner table, they can adjust the script however they want. I'll be here in my little kitchen with my messy kids and my tired husband and my boundaries that took me way too long to build, eating slightly overcooked pasta, and finally not apologizing for being happy. And since you've made it this far into this whole mess, it probably helps to know that none of this started with my ex or my sister or a social media app. This thing with my mother choosing sides, it's been going on since before I even knew what choosing sides meant. When we were little, it was 100 small things that didn't seem like a big deal on their own. You stack them up, though, and it's like building a tower out of tiny insults and lopsided rules. I remember one birthday where all I wanted was this simple art set. Nothing fancy, just a box with markers and paints. I talked about it for weeks. My mother nodded and said we'd see. On my birthday, I opened my presents, and there it was. I was so happy I couldn't sit still. My sister came over, grabbed a marker without asking, and immediately drew all over the table. When my mother saw the mess, she yelled at me for not watching her and took the whole set away. Said I clearly wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. My sister cried for about 30 seconds and then got ice cream. There was a time in middle school when I was supposed to go to a school dance with some friends. I'd planned my outfit for days, saved up to buy a cheap dress from a clearance rack. An hour before my ride was supposed to pick me up, my sister had a meltdown about not finding her favorite shirt. She screamed, threw things, locked herself in the bathroom. My mother pulled me aside and said that maybe I should skip the dance to keep the peace because my sister was having a really hard week. So I texted my friends a lie about feeling sick, took off my dress, and spent the night helping my sister look for a shirt she had stuffed under her own bed. By the time I was in high school, I had basically become a third parent in that house. I was the one who double-checked that forms were signed, that the fridge actually had food, that my sister had her homework in her bag. My mother would brag to people that she didn't need to worry with me because I was so mature, which sounded like a compliment, but really meant she felt free to put everything on my shoulders. When my sister got in trouble for sneaking out, my mother cried about how it was her fault for not being a better mother. Somehow, the solution she landed on was asking me to keep a closer eye on my sister, like I didn't already have my own life to manage. I tried to earn my way into being loved the same way my sister was just handed it. I brought home good grades. I avoided drama. I got a part-time job as soon as I could and used my money to buy my own school supplies so my mother wouldn't have to. Every time I hit some milestone, my mother would say she was proud. But there was always a little but attached. Proud. But maybe I shouldn't talk about college plans in front of my sister because it made her feel insecure. Proud. But maybe I shouldn't mention my promotion at the clinic because my sister was having a rough patch at work. Looking back, it's almost funny how long I bought into the idea that if I was just good enough, calm enough, understanding enough, my mother would eventually see me the way she saw my sister. Like there was a secret scorecard I could fill up with good deeds until it tipped in my favor. Spoiler, there was no scorecard. There was just a story my mother liked better, and I didn't fit into the role she wrote for me unless I was sacrificing something for someone else. After the call where I finally told her to go ask the daughter she chose, I won't lie, I had a bit of an emotional hangover. You don't cut off your own mother and then just skip off into the sunset whistling. I had years of habits built into my nervous system. If my phone buzzed late at night, my brain still flinched, expecting some crisis I was supposed to fix. For a long time, if I saw an older woman in a store with the same hair color or the same walk as my mother, my stomach would twist before my brain caught up and reminded me I was free to just keep walking. My husband kept gently nudging me toward therapy, not in a pushy way, more like, hey, you don't have to untangle all of this by yourself, right? I resisted because the idea of telling yet another person this whole saga felt exhausting. And also because there's this little voice in my head that always goes, maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe you were being dramatic. That voice, by the way, sounds a lot like my mother. Eventually I went. I found a therapist through a list my doctor gave me, and I sat in a chair that was too soft and told a stranger that my sister had married my ex, my mother had chosen her side, and I was the one everyone called dramatic. The therapist didn't flinch. She didn't tell me to be more understanding. She didn't say, but she is your mother. Like that explained everything. She just nodded and asked what it had been like to grow up in that house. We didn't jump straight into the big stuff. We talked about the little patterns. How I apologized even when I wasn't wrong. How I felt guilty for enjoying a quiet afternoon with my kids because some part of me thought I should be checking on my mother instead. How I almost texted my sister a picture of my daughter's first steps out of pure muscle memory and then had to sit on my hands. Therapy didn't magically fix everything, but it gave me language for things I had always felt and never named. I learned that setting boundaries wasn't the same thing as being cruel. That saying no to something harmful didn't make me the villain, no matter how many times my mother tried to hand me that costume. I learned to catch myself before I apologized for things that were not my fault. I learned that the little knot of panic I got in my chest when I heard my phone ring with an unknown number wasn't me being weird. It was a body that had been trained to expect bad news disguised as obligations. There was one session where my therapist asked me what I would say to my own daughter if she grew up and told me the same story about her family. That question almost broke me. I pictured my girl, taller, older, calling me from some small kitchen of her own, voice shaking, telling me that her partner had betrayed her and her sibling had joined in, and I had taken their side. The idea made me feel physically sick. I blurted out that I would never do that I would show up for her, that I would burn the world down before I let her feel as alone as I did. My therapist just looked at me and said, "So, why does your mother deserve more loyalty than you would ever expect from your own kids?" That one sat with me on the drive home. While the kids argued in the back seat about who got the better snack, I kept turning it over in my mind. I had been measuring everything by this unspoken rule that my mother got automatic loyalty. No matter what she did, I had never stopped to ask why. Once I started asking, the answer was not pretty. It was basically because she told me so. Little by little, I let myself off the hook. I stopped checking her social media through a fake account to see if she was talking about me. I unfollowed the relatives who only ever reached out to tell me that my mother missed me or that life was short and I should forgive. I focused on the people who showed up with casseroles and rides and late-night texts that actually said, "How are you doing?" instead of, "Have you talked to your mother yet?" Holidays were the real test. The first year after I set that hard boundary, the whole season felt off. You know how you can tell what month it is by the decorations in every store and the songs playing everywhere, whether you like it or not. All the commercials were about big, happy families around tables that nobody needed to squeeze around. Grandmothers laughing in slow motion while kids ran through the house. My reality was me and my husband trying to figure out how to cook a decent turkey in a tiny oven while my son asked if grandma was coming over. We decided to build our own traditions from scratch. On one of the big holidays, instead of forcing some picture-perfect meal, we made a rule that everyone got to pick one favorite food, no matter how weird the combination. That is how we ended up with mashed potatoes, pancakes, chicken nuggets, and a terrible attempt at a homemade pie all on the same table. The kids thought it was hilarious. My son said it was like having 4 holidays in one. My daughter was mostly just excited about whipped cream. There was a moment that first year where my phone buzzed and I saw a message from a relative I hadn't heard from in a long time. It was the classic script. They said my mother was so sad and that the house was so quiet and that it would mean the world if I just stopped by even for a little bit. I stared at that message for a long time, feeling the old guilt creeping up my spine. Then I looked at my kids, faces sticky with syrup, laughing at a joke my husband had made. And I realized that leaving our house full of warmth and noise to go sit in a living room where everything I did would be judged was not an act of kindness. It would be a sacrifice to a story I was done playing a part in. So, I put the phone on silent, slid it into a drawer, and sat back down at the table. My husband squeezed my knee under the table, like he knew exactly what had just happened in my head. Maybe he did. He has had a front row seat to all of this after all. There were awkward moments outside of the holidays, too. Once at the grocery store, I saw my mother in the next aisle over. She was standing there staring at a shelf of canned soup like it had personally offended her. For a second, I froze. Every muscle in my body went tense. Part of me wanted to duck behind a display of cereal and hide. Another part wanted to walk over and demand to know if she ever thought about what she had done. In the end, I did neither. I took a breath, steered my cart down a different aisle, and kept shopping. My heart was racing. But when I walked out of that store without having been dragged into another performance, I felt strangely powerful. My kids are growing up with a different version of family than the one I had. They have a mother who will apologize when she is wrong. And yes, I mess up all the time. I snap when I'm tired. I say yes to too many school committees. I forget Spirit Day and send my son in regular clothes. But when I screw up, I tell them. I say, I should not have yelled, I am sorry. And I watch the way their shoulders relax when they realize it is safe to tell the truth in our house. Sometimes my son asks questions that poke right into the soft spots. He once asked if my mother used to make me pancakes the way I make them for him on Saturdays. I told him the truth in a simple way. I said that Grandma did some things well and some things not so well. And one of the things she was not good at was making people feel safe when they were upset. I told him that is why I try so hard to do it differently. He thought about it for a second and then said, "You are good at it," and went back to drowning his breakfast in syrup like we were not talking about generational cycles of emotional neglect. There are still nights where the whole story hits me in a wave. I'll be folding tiny socks or filling out yet another school form, and some random detail will pop into my head. The look on my sister's face the night she tried on my veil. The sound of my mother's voice in the hospital hallway. The feeling in my chest when I told my mother to ask the daughter she chose. On those nights, I let myself feel it. I cry in the shower. I vent to my husband. Sometimes I sit on the couch after everyone is asleep and scroll back through pictures of my kids to remind myself what I chose and why. If there is any kind of peace in all of this, it is not the calm, tidy kind people write inspirational quotes about. It is more like standing in the kitchen at the end of a long day, surrounded by dishes and toys and school papers, and realizing that the chaos around me is mine, my mess, my noise, my little family that I built out of the scraps of a story that was supposed to break me. I'm not healed in some perfect straight line. I'm just a woman who finally decided that being the villain in someone else's narrative was still better than playing the doormat in it. And yes, sometimes I still lie awake replaying old conversations and reminding myself why I won't go back, even when a small part of me misses the fantasy of having a normal mother. But mostly I sleep just fine these days. I sleep in a bed I paid for next to a man who chose me on purpose, in a house where my kids laugh too loud and spill things without fearing punishment. That is the story I am writing now, and it is the only one that really matters to me. Have you ever had to rewrite your own family story to finally find peace? Tell me what you think. I really want to know.